Welcome to the final session of History 1. In this class, we're going to talk about the end of rock and roll. Sometimes people ask, why is it that this course goes from basically the beginning of American popular music traditions, going back at least to the colonial period for the very first session, and then ends up in 1959 or 1960, however you want to think of it. Why those dates? And the answer is that it's quite deliberate. It's not just arbitrary picking of a decade at which to end. In a sense, what happens is rock and roll can be thought of as a kind of interstitial form of music, right? In some ways, as we saw with Fats Domino and as we saw with Little Richard and so on, it's building out of things that go back at least to the Tin Pan Alley period and probably before that, so at least in the 1920s. It's building on the jump blues of the 40s. It's building on the Chicago blues of the late 40s and early 50s. It's building on all of these older traditions, blues crooner traditions and so on. And then, because of various things, because of Presley going off to Germany for military service, because of Little Richard retiring in late 57, early 58, because of Chuck Berry, of course, being imprisoned and then in the courts throughout most of the early 60s and then in prison for a while. And as we'll see, the death of Johnny Cochran and so on, the rock and roll era ends in a kind of tragedy. It ends with a void right at the end of the 50s and into the early 60s. On the one hand, rock and roll has experienced a kind of unimaginable success. It's been a major part of this crossover phenomenon of the second half of the 50s, so much so that Billboard magazine considered getting rid of chart divisions and just talking about the most popular records, because so many of these records by people like Jerry Lee Lewis, by people like Elvis Presley, by people like Fats Domino, they were showing up on multiple charts. So the distinction, especially between the R&B charts and the pop charts, seemed to erode for a little while. And some people took this to mean all sorts of different things. But at the very least, what it meant was that the market for music now has shifted toward the youth, toward people in their teens and early 20s. Into the early 50s, I suppose, early 30s, I suppose, but mostly teens and 20-year-olds, people in their 20s. It had become more and more of a cross-charting phenomenon, as we said, and this idea of the rock and roll sensibility quickly moved from being a kind of novelty music, from being a kind of music that was on the edges of mainstream culture, to becoming very much part of the mainstream culture. So much part of the mainstream culture that a certain element of how we thought about rock and roll kind of dies too. The spirit of it dies. Anyone who takes early Elvis seriously doesn't think of later Elvis as being the same thing, as being rock and roll. Anyone who takes Chuck Berry and Little Richard seriously doesn't think of the music that's being played for the most part on American Bandstand with Dick Clark as being the same thing, right? And yet, of course, it's absorbed elements of rock and roll, but transformed it into something a lot more palatable for the mainstream, a lot more easy to digest in that sense. So today we're kind of talking about endings, which is appropriate for the last session of our course. Let's get started. So, Rockabilly at Sun Records. Sam Phillips, after the success of Elvis, remember he felt he had to sell off Elvis's contract in order to pay debts and in order to kind of get out from under with the hole that was created from that success. Because again, remind yourselves a bit of the fact that an independent record label wants some success. They don't want an overriding success because that can potentially bankrupt them. Phillips' way of getting around that dilemma was to sell Elvis's contract, which was quite lucrative. But Phillips basically thought, well, I want to try to capture lightning in a bottle a second time. If I could make that work with Elvis, especially, you have to keep in mind that Sam Phillips didn't necessarily think Elvis was any great singing talent, right? He thought that Jerry Lee Lewis, for instance, was a lot more talented and Carl Perkins. And so he figured, if I could do it with this guy, with Elvis Presley, then I can have just as much of a success with these other instrumentalists. So he started to concentrate on a roster of white musicians who combined country music and R&B in a mostly up-tempo, rocking manner. In other words, rockabilly. And he had a whole roster of talent, right? So you had Carl Perkins of Blue Suede Shoes, which of course Elvis wound up covering that song, but that was a huge hit for Carl Perkins. Perkins was a composer and a guitarist, unlike Presley. I mean, Presley played a little guitar, but Perkins was a real guitarist and a composer, as well as being a singer. And so, Sam Phillips invested a lot of hope in him. And of course, Jerry Lee Lewis was a huge talent as far as Phillips was concerned. A pianist, a very, very bright and talented pianist, and a very good songwriter. And so those two alone, Phillips thought that he was going to be able to build a reputation on. But he also had Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison. As you know, Johnny Cash winds up being going toward the country side of things, and we'll talk about how that happens. But at first, he's part of this rockabilly movement. And same with Roy Orbison, who I don't think any of us really think of him as being a rockabilly star. His voice doesn't really suit that very well, if you know tunes by him like Pretty Woman and so on. And yet, early on, that's how Sam Phillips was trying to market him. So Carl Perkins. Perkins actually sought out Phillips, not the other way around. He heard Elvis's version of Blue Moon of Kentucky, and this was a tune that Carl Perkins himself had been performing in various bands around this time, and he also had been performing it in an up-tempo fashion, performing it in 4/4. So he felt that Phillips really understood what he was trying to do. After all, I mean, they basically hit upon the same kind of thing that Perkins was doing. And supposedly he was in the car with his wife, and he hears Blue Moon in Kentucky. He says, I got to find out who recorded that, and I need to record with that person. So he contacted Phillips, described why he was contacting him, and came in for an audition. In 1956, he has a hit with Blue Suede Shoes, which is a number 2 pop, a number 2 R&B, and a number 1 country. So a very, very strong crossover hit that held the charts pretty well for a little bit there. And so Carl Perkins looked like he was a true successor in some ways, if not even someone who would go a little further, at least in rockabilly, if he were to stay with rockabilly, than Elvis did. Then you had, of course, Johnny Cash. In 1954, Cash moves to Memphis with his first wife, Vivian, to study to be a radio announcer. So in other words, he's doing something very akin to what Sam Phillips had done. He auditioned for Phillips with a handful of gospel tunes, and Phillips turned him down. He said, well, this isn't really what I'm trying to do. But Cash returns in 1955 and recorded the tunes Hey Porter and Cry, Cry, Cry. And they had some success on the country charts. And if you listen to those tunes, you can hear a little bit of the rockabilly element creeping into them. I wouldn't say that Johnny Cash was ever a full-out rockabilly star, although plenty of people do say that. And you can hear, you definitely on Cry, 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 you can hear that Sam Phillips echo, the slapback echo, and how that sort of impacts the sound. In 1956, he has one of his great songs released, Folsom Prison Blues, which was the number 4 country. And that's the song where he says, I killed a man in Reno just to watch him die. And that particular line is a pretty chilling line in a lot of ways, right? That the character that he's starting to create through these various songs is someone who is clearly flawed, is clearly troubled, is clearly dangerous, but doesn't exactly make apologies or excuses for any of that. And then I Walk the Line in 1956 was a number 17 pop hit. In 1957, he becomes the first Sun artist to release a full LP, right? Elvis was not the first Sun artist to do so because he didn't release an album with Sun. He released an album with RCA. So the first Sun artist to release a full LP was Johnny Cash. By the end of 57, though, he moves on to Columbia Records, and so does Perkins, right? So once again, Sam Phillips sort of loses his talent to a much larger record company, and he loses both Perkins and Cash to Columbia Records. And that's really when the Cash, I mean, probably a lot of us who enjoy Johnny Cash, those of us who do enjoy him probably know the songs Folsom Prison Blues and I Walk the Line. But most of his hits, most of the things that make him more familiar as a country artist took place after that move to Columbia. In 1960, he begins touring with the Carter family, which at this point is really just Maybelle with her daughters, including June Carter, and Johnny Cash will eventually marry her. And he releases Ring of Fire in 63, and that's his first real crossover hit. So unlike a lot of Sam Phillips' other stars, while he's at Sun, he's not really getting a lot of crossover hits. He's got the one song on the pop charts, I Walk the Line, but the rest of them were really country hits. Okay. And then there's Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis broke out in 1957 with the song Whole Lot of Shaking Going On, and he performed it on the Steve Allen Show, where he bangs at the piano and flings his hair around wildly and kicks at the piano stool, and just this made a huge impact on people, though he's a kind of wild man. And he has a string of hits after that, but all this crashed, in a sense, and came to an end when he let slip that his third wife was really his 14-year-old cousin. Now, in the 1950s, that wasn't that rare in certain parts of the South, but on a national level, that was considered something quite embarrassing, both her age and the fact that she was his cousin. And you can see them together there. And this really ruins his career. He's made fun of. A lot of people find it scandalous, and as many of us would today. Obviously, I mean, today the idea, even in the South, of marrying someone who's 14 years old, most of us would not approve that kind of behavior. Like I said, at that time, in certain rural parts of the South, it's not unheard of, and the third cousin thing certainly, actually she wasn't third cousin, she was his third wife, but she was, I don't know, I think first cousin. But at any rate, things that bothered the rest of the nation might not have bothered people in the exact location where he was born, but he's now on the national stage, and this became, obviously, an embarrassment. On December 5th, 1956, I just include this because it was a famous moment for Sam Phillips. At this point, Elvis is already at RCA Records. The other three in that picture, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins, they're all still at Sun Records at this point. Perkins and Cash have not yet left. And really, I forget whose session it actually was. I think it might have been Perkins. I know it wasn't Elvis's. He wasn't there anymore, and it wasn't. I know it wasn't Cash's, but it might have been Jerry Lee Lewis's, or it might have been Perkins. But either way, the others just sort of showed up. Elvis happened to be in town. I mean, his mother lived outside of Memphis, and so he was still in that area a lot, and he just sort of drops by, and Johnny Cash had just dropped by, and they were listening in on the sessions, and then next thing you know, there is a session. Sam Phillips, very, I guess, cannily, sends out, calls the local newspaper, and they send the reporter and a photographer and take a bunch of pictures and do a whole write-up. They record these things. It's basically an impromptu jam on various gospel tunes and so on. And you can listen to it. You can find it on YouTube and so on. But it wasn't released at the time. It really just became a kind of publicity opportunity, because here you have Elvis, who at that point was probably the biggest entertainer in the country already after that skyrocketing ascent of his, and it's almost as though he's introducing these other far lesser known artists. At this point, Jerry Lee Lewis doesn't even really have a hit. His first hit's not until 1957. So this was a way for Sam Phillips to use some of the star power that Elvis had, and bring it to these three performers that he's hoping will really take off. Now, of course, other labels quickly get the idea that if Rockabilly is a success for Sam Phillips, it can be a success for them. We already saw, of course, that RCA buys out Elvis's contract. And we also just talked about the fact that Jerry Lee Lewis and I'm sorry, not Jerry Lee Lewis, that Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash wind up going to Columbia, right? Now, Johnny Cash, of course, goes to Columbia as a country artist, but Carl Perkins goes as a rockabilly artist. So you can see the big labels are trying to buy up some of that Sun sound by buying the talent. So they often, other labels start to have their singers perform in a more or less an Elvis-like drawl, and they try to use some of his mannerisms while also attempting to recreate that slapback echo effect that was Phillips' closely guarded secret. Usually they didn't succeed. The RCA recordings of Elvis are a good example of that, where you can clearly hear they're attempting to create that sound, but it doesn't quite pan out. But you have some artists like Gene Vincent who are to some extent drawing on Elvis, and Gene Vincent actually to a large extent. His career in the Navy ended when his leg was crushed in a motorbike accident in 1955. And so he begins playing music in his hometown of Norfolk, Virginia. In 1956, he has a hit with Bebop-A-Lula on Capitol Records, right? So Capitol Records, a major record company at this point. And Bebop-A-Lula, listen to it, you'll hear it's basically just a pretty mediocre, in my opinion, Elvis impersonation. But the tune is we're already heading toward where we're going to be in the early 60s. It's a sort of watered down version of Rockabilly. He never gets anywhere near it. I mean, he never releases anything else that captures the national attention the way that tune does. Perhaps more important, certainly more successful, was Eddie Cochran. His hits focused mostly on teenage frustrations, so he had songs that were like 20 Flight Rock, which he performed in the Jane Mansfield film The Girl Can't Help It, and this led to a recording contract with Liberty Records. So he's on one of those independent record one of the independent record labels. But he does quite well for himself. He has several hits. Summertime Blues is one of his most famous. If you've heard anything from him, it's probably that. And then Come On Everybody was another big hit. He's one of the first people, recording artists, to use multi-track recording. So he's really among the very first to exploit that technique, where he's playing both the rhythm guitar and the lead guitar on several of his recordings. He also really exploits distortion. It's a pretty mild distortion. It's along the lines of Chuck Berry, but he and Chuck Berry are innovators in that sense. And then obviously overdubbing, right? Because I just said he overdubs himself playing lead above his own rhythms. He winds up dying in an auto accident in 1960, and in that same accident, Gene Vincent, was injured, right? So here we have two more casualties of the rock and roll era. Eddie Cochran's dead, and Gene Vincent is hospitalized and then in a long-term recovery. And like I said, he never really got anywhere much after Bebop-A-Lula. It's worth listening to Eddie Cochran. He's got an interesting approach to the guitar of the rock and roll era that's very different from Chuck Berry, but very interesting also. Then, of course, there's Buddy Holly, who was influenced by Elvis, signed to Decca, but didn't do very well. Then he wound up going to Coral Records and Brunswick. And so one of the problems when you get the complete works of Buddy Holly is you have to get two copies, because he has several in Coral and several in Brunswick. And many of the Brunswick recordings are the more famous ones, but some of the Coral recordings are actually, I think, a little better. They're definitely very interesting. And so he has the same songs that he's recorded with both companies in many cases. His first hit was That'll Be the Day in 1957. That was the number one pop hit, number two R&B. The refrain, the chorus line, That'll Be the Day, is based on the famous line from John Wayne, when he says, obviously, that'll be the day, in the movie The Searchers from 1956. So Buddy Holly thought it was basically a badass line, and it was. So he used it for this song. Then he has seven top 40 hits after that. Listen to Peggy Sue, for instance, and you can hear his approach to vocal technique. There's something almost a little basically what happens with the 50s is a lot of these singers start using these various mannerisms, and some of it's a little novelty esque, if you wish, and then some of it is trying to make their own sound, as in the way that Elvis did, right? Creating some kind of vocal mannerism that stands out so people recognize it. With Buddy Holly, he has a couple of them, and one of them is this hiccuping sound when he's singing Peggy Sue, right? And like I said, there are multiple versions of a lot of these recordings. So the famous one is the one with the hiccup sound, but you can easily find others that don't have it as much. He died in a plane crash on February 3rd, 1959. This is sometimes referred to as the day the music died, because he was in that plane crash. So was Ritchie Valens, and so was the Big Bopper, who was a radio DJ, but who also had a few singles out, had a few hits. So here's Ritchie Valens, another person who died in that plane crash. In 1958, Bob Keane, the owner of the small Hollywood label Delphi Records, heard about a young Richard Valenzuela, and he began recording him under the name Ritchie Valens. His second record was the double A side, meaning that they tried to promote both sides as singles, and that had Donna and La Bamba, and both were incredibly successful singles, right? And they are very different songs. Donna is very clearly drawing on the doo-wop tradition, on the vocal harmony group tradition, right? So you've got that very typical triplet feel from that tradition, the kind of swooning vocal sound and so on. Whereas La Bamba is very clearly drawing on Latin influences, especially a kind of Latin rock. In a way, he's the inventor of Latin rock, so he's considered the pioneer of both Chicano and Latin rock. And you can hear that in the guitar style of La Bamba. Even if you just listen to the opening again with that rising lower string line, and the way that it plays off the whole tune with just the right amount of distortion and echo, right? It's one of those sounds that once you hear it, you'll recognize it forever. It'll stick in your head. This, by the way, La Bamba was one of the very few top 40 hits of that time with all Spanish lyrics. That didn't happen that often. It becomes much more typical in the 70s, as we'll see next semester. But in the 50s, for the most part, Spanish language tunes, there might be a line or two in Spanish, but most of it would have been in English. And as I mentioned, Valens dies in the plane crash with Buddy Holly. So notice that there's a sort of string of bad events that just take place at the end of the rock and roll era. All those harmony groups start to drift apart or become less popular. Bill Haley kind of burns out, and then we've seen like all these deaths and Elvis leaving for the army and so on. Now, an indicator of where things are heading would be Leiber and Stoller. Now, if you remember, we've seen them before, of course. Leiber and Stoller wrote Hound Dog and had it recorded in 1952 by Big Mama Thornton, and that was a big hit for them, right? They're considered the first important songwriting team in the rock and roll era. I would say that there were probably a few other important teams, like Dave Bartholomew and Alan Toussaint in the New Orleans sound, but certainly Leiber and Stoller are among the important ones. They had their first hits with Hard Times in 52, recorded by Charles Brown, and then Kansas City, also in 52, which became a number one pop when it was re-recorded in 1959. And then, of course, Hound Dog in 52, first recorded by Big Mama Thornton, and then became a huge hit when Elvis recorded it in the latter half of the 50s. They wound up forming their own record company. So instead of just writing songs, they wanted to form their own company and become producers as well. And so they formed Spark Records in 1953 with Lester Sill. The label was bought out by Atlantic Records, and Leiber and Stoller then get a contract. And this is what's super important about them for us. They sign a contract with Atlantic Records in which they were allowed to produce for other labels. So they're now independent record producers. This is the first time really that's happened in any contractual, any regularized way in the history of popular music. So they are independent, freelance, if you will, record producers. And they, working at Atlantic Records, you learn a lot. Atlantic had one of the great producers, of course. We've talked a bit about that already. And obviously they put a lot of money and care into their recordings. And so Lieber and Stoller learn a lot there and then can apply that knowledge all over the place, right? While they're at Atlantic or associated with Atlantic, they revitalized the careers of the Drifters and with Benny King, and we'll look at that in a second. They also created a spin-off group of the Robins, so another one of these bird-named vocal harmony groups, and they renamed them the Coasters, and they wrote a whole bunch of songs for them, like Charlie Brown, Searchin', Yakety Yak. And in this period, they're really focusing on this sort of honking sax sound that you hear in Yakety Yak and in Charlie Brown a bit. And then these little playlets, what they call playlets, right? Basically song skits where Charlie Brown is about, a kid at school and everybody always picking on me, right? And so they tell this story over the course of it, very much like what Chuck Berry's doing. But because they have multiple singers, there's a little bit of implied acting that goes on in it. Now, again, there's a novelty aspect to this. I think we would be hard-pressed, and maybe we better stop trying so hard to think of novelty as a bad thing, right? Maybe we tend to be somewhat dismissive, and I mean me here as well, obviously, when we say novelty music, as though it's somehow less important. But novelty music is also how jazz began. It's how a lot of styles begin, because they capture people's attention, and it seems like it's going to be a flash in the pan, and it turns out to be more. So then, of course, they reformed the Drifters with Benny King, and you can see the very young Benny King there. He's front in the line there, along with Charlie Thomas, Doc Green, and Ellsbury Hobbs. This is a good period for the Drifters, 58 to the early 60s. In 58, they released There Goes My Baby, and this was the first big release with Benny King as the lead singer. This was the first black music release in R&B with huge production elements. So you'll hear it when you listen to it. You should listen carefully to this recording. There's a big string orchestra. The way that they build up to the refrain line, right? There goes my baby, with that echo. And I mean, there's a lot here that's going to carry over into the 60s. One of the people that's at those sessions and learning from these sessions is Phil Spector. And we'll see in the 60s what he does with the Wall of Sound, but he's getting some of that from Lieber and Stoller, because Lieber and Stoller wrote the song, they produced the song. They're the minds behind this big sort of almost quasi 60s sound, the sound that would come to dominate the 60s here in 58, right? And Phil Spector even played guitar on some of the Drifters sessions. So if you're interested in Phil Spector, it's kind of on the boardwalk, or under the boardwalk rather. He plays the guitar solo on that and a few other things. So they wind up becoming, as we'll see next semester, mentors to the Brill Building composers, and we'll talk about them next semester. So Elvis is in the Army. Little Richard's back to religion. Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis are disgraced. Cochran, Valens, Holly, the Big Bopper, they're all dead. Gene Vincent's hurt and really basically out of the running. I didn't mention it, but Carl Perkins gets into a pretty bad accident, and he's kind of sidelined for a while. It just seems, the whole thing seems kind of doomed. And so this is, of course, a picture of the aftermath of the plane crash that took the lives of Richie Valens and Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper. Many people sort of thought that this, remember that the 50s, we're still talking about the Eisenhower era. This is the age when the baby boomers were reaching teenagehood and really young adulthood. And so there's a lot of sort of mysticism that goes into this. And so, songs like Bye Bye, Miss American Pie or whatever, about the day the music died. This is the day that he's talking about in that song, right? And so a lot of that generation, my parents' generation, really romanticized this era and it coming to an end the way that it did. Sort of, I don't know, almost makes it into a kind of mythological moment. But another thing that really brought it all to an end. I mean, the deaths obviously weren't great, and Elvis going off to the army, not great, and jails and people getting jailed and so on. But the thing that really kind of buries rock and roll to a certain extent here, and as far as this era of rock and roll and what we think of as actual rock and roll, and we'll see how the 60s sort of deal with the aftermath of this. I wouldn't say they deal with it all that well creatively at first, until really Motown becomes a thing. So there's a few years of a gap of very much interest when, you have songs like Palisades Park and these kind of whatever, not terribly interesting tunes. But what brings a lot of this to an end is really the Payola scandal. What brings rock and roll to an end. Now, the definition of payola, the FCC, the oversight committee, right, for the things that are broadcast on the national airwaves, so the radio and the television, they define payola as a violation of the sponsorship identification rule. So what that means is it's perfectly fine to get money from sponsors, right? For instance, as you can see here, Lucky Strike presents Your Hit Parade. Their name is part of the title of the show, right? That's perfectly fine because everyone knows that when they're tuning into this, that they're supporting Lucky Strike and that Lucky Strike's supporting this. So it's perfectly fine to do that. You're even allowed to play records that you're playing just because you received gifts or money. That's fine too. So let's say I'm really wealthy and you're a radio DJ. I'm allowed to give you $100 or whatever. Say, play this 3 times today. Here's $100, and you can do it and not get in trouble. But the problem is you have to do 2 things that the government's concerned with. One is you have to announce on the air that that's what happened. So you could say, oh, Chad Jenkins, he really wants us to play this song. He even gave me a tip or whatever. As long as you say it you give it credit, you say what is going on the air, that makes it okay. And then, of course, the other thing that you have to do is you have to claim it on your income tax. And that's the big one, right? That's how they get Capone. That's how they get all of it. Whenever they can't get you on whatever they want to get you on, they get you on income tax. That's how it works. So that's a big part of the Payola scandal. Payola was largely ignored prior to the 1950s. Your Hit Parade, which started in 1935 and was still broadcasted in the 50s, they never revealed how they decided what songs were actually on the Hit Parade. They call it Your Hit Parade. How are they deciding what the top 40 tunes are? Back when Top 40 Radio began, they didn't disclose how they made those decisions, and some of that was above board. They were looking at Billboard magazine and so on, but it usually didn't match Billboard, and they said, oh well, we have these sources in the record industry and from certain corporations. Yeah, maybe they had some of that, but they were also getting paid, right? So that if a producer had enough money and they were hoping to get their song on the top 40, they pay you a little. Now, if Casey Kasem comes out every Saturday and he says, oh, this is a top 40 hit, you're going to think it's a top 40 hit. And it's going to get in your head because that's how top 40 radio works. It plays the same 40 songs over and over again. So this idea of you're being fooled and you don't even know it is not announced on the air. That is the part that becomes the problem because this is a way of manipulating audiences. Like I said, this has been going on for a long time. The difference was that publishers benefited from payola before. So it was okay because ASCAP didn't care. They didn't say anything about it because they were the ones benefiting, right? If an ASCAP composer is getting his or her stuff played on the air, that's all to the good. It becomes a problem when non-establishment songwriters, all these BMI people, all these rock and roll composers and country composers and R&B composers that aren't part of ASCAP, That's when it becomes a problem. Well, why do you think that is? Because ASCAP's got all the lobbyist money. ASCAP's the one that's going to be able to pursue lawsuits, right? So these other people are getting advantages from Payola, so now it's a problem. And ASCAP has the ear of the government, whereas BMI doesn't. It's still pretty small at this point. And so the Payola scandals begin. The point of the Payola scandals, to a certain extent, was to break BMI and to break the power of the DJs. Remember, BMI was only founded as an alternative to ASCAP, and it mostly catered to composers in the country, rock and roll, and R&B genres. So these poorer and poorer composers, people coming from poorer social brackets, on independent labels that are struggling to make a way in the world and yet having a lot of success with rock and roll. And so they're threatening to the majors. BMI is threatening to ASCAP, and so they attempt to shut it down. And the DJs are getting more and more power, right? They're getting more and more money. They're becoming personality jocks. That term comes about from around this time, where people are tuning in to listen to Alan Freed to actually hear what he has to say, not just to see what records he spins, right? Like Casey Kasem's another good example of that, where people tune into that. I mean, that guy's dead now, I think, but people still listen to him. Every Saturday, my mom plays him because of that voice, and you hear him tell a little story about the whatever years, right? So this guy still has a personality that's attracting people from beyond the grave, right? So that's really something there. So the Payola scandal was an effort by the major labels and ASCAP to shut down the independent labels and BMI. While Payola happened all the time, it was more crucial for the unestablished independents and BMI artists. So it was also a response to the increasing power of the DJ. In 1950, there were about 250 DJs working in the U.S. In 1957, there were over 5,000. Right, so we're no longer talking about people just spinning records and keeping their mouths shut. And remember, people like Alan Freed are thought of as being kind of a bit of a danger, because what is he doing? He's not only a DJ in New York at this point who's playing a lot of black records and promoting the black records over the white cover records, and that was very important to him, in part because he had a financial investment. I'm not trying to make him out to be some kind of race relations hero. He had a financial investment in these groups that he's promoting, but he's mostly promoting black music, and I don't want to take that away from him. In part, he seemed to really believe in that music, that he invested in it for a reason, right? But he's touring the country, and he insists on having integrated audiences for these integrated shows that he's putting on. It's mostly black artists, but some white artists, and obviously he's white. And so there's the riot in Boston that I mentioned, where a riot breaks out, a fight breaks out, and he gets blamed for it and jailed for a bit of time. And so people are looking to shut him down. He becomes kind of the focal point in some ways. So the hearings begin. November of 1959, the House Special Subcommittee on Legislative Oversight, chaired by Orrin Harris, and you can see Orrin Harris there. He's the one that's looking kind of pissed off in this picture, while the other guy's pointing his finger and smoking a cigar, right? Back when you did that in Congress. They begin taking testimony in November of 59. Now, this, in a way, some people think that the Payola scandal wouldn't have been that big of a deal, except that something else was already going on that was similar to Payola in the world of TV. And that was the quiz shows. Turns out that the show called Quiz Show, which was basically the Jeopardy of its day, it was rigged. Right? They found the guy that they thought was interesting looking and that was attractive enough that audiences would tune in, and they would give him the answers. And one of the guys who was, I guess more average looking, found out about it, and he squealed because he didn't want to lose because they're cheating, obviously. So this is a quiz show where a decent amount of money is involved. Prize money, but also a decent amount of money in ratings and so on. And so the producers are thinking, well, this is TV. It's all fake. None of it's real, right? And in a way, it's like the reality shows of its day, right? I mean, no one takes anything on Big Brother as being real. That's not real. As we call it reality TV show. It's the exact opposite of reality in every possible way, right? And that's what these were too. So these guys, in one sense, you could say they're ahead of their time, but they were promoting this as a real contest, and it turns out it was rigged. So there were Senate hearings about it to regulate that. if there's that much money involved, the Senate gets involved, or rather House committee meetings, subcommittee meetings. So some historians feel that Payola kind of came up because Orrin Harris was like, well, this was fun. What do we do next, right? What else do we have oversight on? And the Payola thing was brought to their attention. Again, this is a practice that's been going on since at least the 30s, really the 20s. So as long as there was radio, there was Payola. As long as there was a real profit in recordings, there was Payola. But now it becomes an issue for the various reasons we've just discussed. So Wesley Hopkins of KYW in Cleveland, he said he got $12,000 in listening fees that he did not disclose on his taxes over the course of 2 years. 12,000, right? So 6,000 extra a year. I would like 6,000 extra a year now, and that's in 2020 dollars. This is an extra 6,000 a year in 1958 dollars or $59. A lot of money, right? But it gets worse. Phil Lind, a DJ at Chicago's WAIT, claimed he once made $22,000 to play a single record. Now, there's no way to verify this, although why would he say it if it makes him look bad, right? And he's just admitted to tax fraud because he did not claim those $22,000. So one assumes that he may be exaggerating, but to his own detriment. At any rate, this becomes an issue. It really becomes an issue when I think it was Lind, I don't remember, but one of them gives testimony, and he refuses to say even whether or not he was at this event. But apparently there was a record event in Florida where a bunch of DJs were invited for a long weekend in Florida, hosted by I think Decca Records, but I don't remember which record company it was. And basically they were given free meals, free entertainment, and a whole lot of prostitutes. And this was really the story that apparently turned Orrin Harris's stomach, as he put it, and that he decided this was a real issue because it was now an ethical and moral issue. Okay. So there's Alan Freed. Right, the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, get involved, and the radio DJs now, after these hearings, they no longer have the authority to make programming decisions. Right, obviously they're susceptible to Payola, so we'll just take those programming decisions out of their hands. So what they do is now they have a station manager that will make those decisions. And when you show up, you're a DJ, you show up to your gig, 4 o'clock, right? You have the drive time. That's a lucrative slot to have as a DJ, radio DJ. You have the drive time slot. You're handed a list of things that you're going to play that day. You can speak in between them, but you're going to play those things. But here's the thing. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. If you were trying to bribe people at a certain radio station to play your recording before, and you wanted it heard throughout the day, you had to bribe every DJ that had a slot, which could be a lot of DJs. These slots in the 1950s, they usually ran about 2 hours, right? So if you wanted your record played over and over again, you had to pay off several DJs. Now, all you have to do is bribe one station manager. How is this a fix for bribes? Doesn't make any sense. I don't know how anyone thought it did. And that's exactly what happens. Payola doesn't stop. It now becomes corporate, right? Instead of dealing with the on-air talent, now you just deal with the administration, basically, the management, right? And you pay them off. So it's a lot cheaper now. It's a lot easier. And in fact, several people much later, of course, writing memoirs of this era say, I don't know, the House subcommittee made life a lot easier on me. I saved a lot of my bribery money this way. I paid far fewer people. Now, Alan Freed is basically ruined by this. He already had a drinking problem. Let's not pretend he didn't. But he quickly drank himself to death after this. He couldn't get a gig. He really stood up to the House subcommittee. He insisted what he was doing was not wrong. He claimed he did claim most of it on his taxes. He said he probably forgot some of it because there was a lot of it. He was making a lot of money. And when you look at his taxes, he did claim some of it. He didn't always define exactly what it was, and that was one of the things that was held against him. But he did claim a lot of money that didn't show up in normal channels. So he was at least moderately honest, which is more than we can say for some of the other people involved here. But partly because of his identification with black music, partly because of his personality, which was could be somewhat abrasive, partly because he just wouldn't admit that he did anything wrong. He said that he was happy to keep better track of his books and hire somebody to look after his books. But since he did his best to claim those things on his taxes, and since he feels like he did in many cases announce the gifts that he was given on the air, that this is, that so-and-so sent me this record, which he felt was close enough to saying that, he was partly paid to play the record, but he acknowledged the person who gave it to him on the air, and so he felt he should be in the clear. He didn't know why he was here with people like Phil Lind and so on. And he's ruined by this, and therefore a big part of how rock and roll worked, which really he was not the most important DJ all by himself, but he's probably the most important as far as like the first among many. But there's another very important character who's here who gets a very different treatment. Let's look at him next. And that's this guy, Dick Clark. Dick Clark gets nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Now, Dick Clark's an interesting fellow here because Dick Clark has a series of shadow companies. In case you're not sure what that means, what it means is you create basically a dummy corporation, or it's a corporation that does one thing, and you use that in order to sell that one thing to another corporation that you basically have hostage. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's make it make sense. Dick Clark, of course, is the host of American Bandstand, which is this television show where basically teens dance to records, and occasionally a recording artist will show up and then just lip sync to their own records. Right? There weren't really any live performances at American Bandstand. So songs like I mentioned before, Palisades Park, that's a song that debuted at American Bandstand. And so at different times it was more integrated, at other times it was more white audiences, white kids that were dancing. But the point is he's playing mostly, not exclusively, but mostly white music. And he's got this sort of very watered down, it's a sock hop kind of thing. In fact, he hosted sock hops. He toured the country hosting sock hops where kids would show up in their socks and dance to records and pay to be there. That's what I love, right? So he's got this television show where he's making all this money where people pay to watch kids dance. And then he goes on tour and gets the kids to pay to pretend they're on a show, and they're not on the show, they're not being filmed, to have their own thing where he's just playing records. He's just carrying records around whatever. At any rate, he has a bunch of these dummy corporations. So obviously when you have a television show, what do you need? Well, you need cameras, right? And those cameras have bulbs in them, light bulbs in them, and they have cameras in them, the lenses and so on. So he creates a lens corporation and a light corporation and all these little tiny entities where he has exactly one client, and that is American Bandstand. And what he does is because he's got influence, when they put in the bids, he makes sure his company gets the bid. Right? So he's got this spider web, and they put it up on a board during the hearings, and you can find it online. I thought you could. I couldn't find it, or else you'd be looking at it right now, but I'll try to find it again. It's amazing. It's just this huge web of interlocking businesses that he's basically bilking ABC, because ABC is saying, all right, here's your budget. Oh, no, we need a bigger budget. Well, why? Well, because all these companies are demanding more money. They're all his companies. They're all his companies. And when they ask for more money, it's because he's asking for more money. He's making money hand over fist, and this is obviously dishonest. Whatever you want to accuse Alan Freed of, he was pretty open about what he was up to. And yeah, did he claim everything? He even says he didn't, right? He tried to do the best he could, whatever. But this guy is purposefully creating companies without his name on it, where he has someone else that's supposed to be the CEO of it, or sometimes just a fake name, in order to draw off as much money as he can from ABC. But look at him. He's this nice, clean-cut looking guy. He didn't fight back. He said, "Oh, yes, sir. No, sir." Answered the questions. "Oh, I didn't know that was wrong. How would I have known that's wrong? I'm just a businessman. I'm just an entrepreneur." And Orrin Harris literally calls him a good young man. "You're a good young man. You're going to have a big future." The lesson that he says he learned, let's go to the next slide. Whenever Dick Clark talked about this period and those hearings, the lesson he said he learned was CYA. Cover your ass, right? Dick Clark very rarely cusses in interviews, and yet I've heard him do that in interviews 10 to 12 different times, right? He likes that phrase in this context. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't stop doing the stuff that he was doing. He just figured out better ways to do it, right? And this is the man who basically inherits rock and roll for a few years. That's what rock and roll, after the death of rock and roll in the end of 59, early 60, for the next 2 years roughly, before Motown and before the Brill Building composers really become something, and then of course before the British invasion, it's Dick Clark, American Bandstand. This anodyne, watered down pap. That's rock and roll. That's what you got left. So thanks for the semester. See you next semester.